weg. Mein Name ist Josef Winkler, ich bin stellvertretender Fraktionsvorsitzender von Bündnis 90 Die Grünen im Bundestag für den Bereich Innen- und Rechtspolitik und eben auch Netzpolitik. Und ich freue mich jetzt, unseren Gast vorzustellen, der das Eingangsreferat hält, nämlich Frau Professor Saskia Sassen. Frau Sassen ist eine der weltweit profiliertesten und meistgelesenen Soziologinnen. Und wir freuen uns sehr, liebe Saskia, dass du zwischen Vorträgen in China und in Brasilien Zeit für einen kurzen Zwischenstopp in Berlin gefunden hast. Du kommst quasi gerade vom Flughafen und wir freuen uns wirklich sehr, dass die Grünen es geschafft haben, dich hierher in den Maschinenraum des Bundestages zu locken. Saskia ist Robert S. Lund Professor für Sociology an der Columbia University in New York. Wir verdanken ihr bestechende kritische Analysen der globalisierten Welt, von den vernetzten Global Cities und ihren Finanzströmen über die Lage der Flüchtlinge und Migrantinnen hin zum Paradox des Nationalen im Zeitalter transnationaler digitaler Netzwerke. Das von ihr so vorzüglich beschriebene Paradox der immer noch bestehenden Nationalstaaten betrifft die grüne Netzpolitik ganz besonders. Auch für das transnationale, globale Internet sind wir in der Pflicht, national- und europäisch-politische Regulierungsansätze zu finden, damit die Netzfreiheiten erhalten bleiben. Welche neue Macht das Internet Akteuren eröffnet, die bislang als machtlos gegolten haben, ist eine der vielen Fragen, der sie ihr Vortrag widmen wird. Im Anschluss an den Vortrag wird Gelegenheit sein, im Frage- und Antwortverfahren miteinander ins Gespräch zu kommen. Und wir sind sehr gespannt, was wir zu hören bekommen. Saskia, du hast das Wort.
Well, it is an enormous pleasure for me to be here, really. And I only wish you hadn't mentioned that I flew in from Hong Kong. I'm thinking my carbon footprint. I'm speaking to the Greens. The worst possibility. But here I am. I really enjoyed your speech, and I love the idea of this Congress. Now, I understand that if I'm talking about these technologies to members of the Green Party, and I get no, bitte, das ist meine. Ja, danke. There's a whole traffic of glasses here. That it is not as if I were speaking in Silicon Valley, where the passion is the technology, that is the object of, debate, etc. That is part of the story. But I would assume that here the notion is, how do we expand the uses, the utilities, the politics of these technologies in order that we can have a better society, a better political system, etc. So what I want to do is, if we think of the technology with all its variability as the X, the little x, I want to look at all the other elements. It could be a global slum, such as Mumbai's Dharavi slum. It could be a very poor, apparently isolated neighborhood in a big German city. What are all the other elements where that little X, the technology, can mobilize, can activate? In other words, expanding the space, the assemblage of elements, die Zusammensetzung, nicht wahr, von allerlei Elemente, das nicht nur die Technologie ist. And a basic notion, and I put it on, I thought I had a screen, but you can see it there. So the basic point of entry is that the technical properties, and they vary enormously, of these, and I'm thinking of interactive technologies. In other words, where something of the social is made, something interacts. They deliver what they can deliver through complex, they could also be simple, but often they are actually much more complex than they look. Ecologies. Ich meine nun nicht das Ökologische, wissen Sie wie. Ich meine eine Zusammensetzung, nicht wahr, of diverse elements. And those ecologies, those assemblages, include non-technical elements. So I like to compare finance with civil society groups. Sometimes they're using the same technical properties, but what they're using it for is radically different. There is this wonderful formula that I like to use. It is called a Phillips curve, and it's very simple, don't worry. And it's like this, it's like a cross. Two elements, two projects, think finance, civil society, coming from very, very different places, going to very different places, can still have a point of intersection. And for me, it's very in terms of the technology that they're using, the properties that they're using. And for me, it is very interesting to see how different the places from where they might be coming and where they are going are. And so what I'm interested in is that larger ecology. I'm also interested in something else, which I think is critical for all of us. And that is the way in which some actors, and finance is one of them, have known how to use those technologies. They have known how to have the software developers, more or less the whole of Silicon Valley, working to develop the software they need, the hardware properties they need. So when I speak about this curve, that where the different places that they're going to can truly be radically different. And in that sense, understanding the technology, understanding that little moment matters a lot. It can open whole new worlds. Now let me start with a little story. One little assemblage, and I participated in this, so I want to tell it, and just to also stretch our view a bit and take us to a very different place. And the kind of place that I'm talking about is something that I think of as global slums. Now, you know what a slum is, nicht wahr? Slum is a changed word, by the way. Slum, wie sagt man das auf Deutsch, weiß ich nicht. Auf Spanish is it tugurio. Spanish, I'm better in Spanish than I am in German. So we gave a prize, and your Prime Minister, Angela Merkel, insisted in coming and delivering the prize. She was visiting Mohammed Singh, the Prime Minister in India. And the Herrhausen Foundation had put the money, so there was a strong German connection there. And so we selected 2 winners. And it was a rather generous prize, 100,000 euros. And one of them whom we selected was a group of 6 architects from the slums, and they called themselves slum architects, and they had built a little toilet, several toilets, just for women. And on the outside, they had embedded all kinds of technologies so that these women could get online, but that they also could create networks. There was a bit of open source elements. And the reason they made the toilets just for women was because in that setting, if it was a toilet for women, the women were also going to be the ones who got to use the technology, because if not, the men would have taken over. And there was enough space left, and this is the open source element, right, that the participants, the makers, are also adding technological elements, that they could add more elements. Now this captures for me a mix of conditions, but it also captures in a very almost visual, because you can actually see it. I wish I had a slide of it. In a very visual way, that larger ecology within which these technologies function. Now, I am going to get to a slightly more complicated ecologies, because we are here, in a different type of setting. Now, when you think of these technical properties, I am particularly keen when you think of these technologies, if you want, for politics, for making a better world, etc. I am particularly interested, and that is what I have studied most, interactive properties, interactive digital domains. I am less interested, certainly in terms of these subjects, in, let's say, data pipelines, or something which is just carrying. I'm interested in these interactive domains because I think that a particular form of the social gets made. And I say particular because in a way it is a thin social. And because it is a thin social, it is open. It can incorporate. The thicker, like think of a little neighborhood where everybody knows each other completely. They know everything. They've seen you grow up since you were 2 years old. That's a thick sociality. Very nice, very attractive. I'm not putting it down. But if we're going to move ahead politically with these technologies, we are going to need thin socialities. Nicht Sozialismus, das kann dick sein, aber Sozialitäten, nicht wahr? And by sociality, I'm thinking about a thin social. That thin social means that we can network globally. We can incorporate particular people, particular individuals, and no matter their differences of politics, of religion, etc., we can bring them together. And I think that is extremely important. I think that is part of the project. Now, 3 sets of issues that I want to, where is my clock? That I want to develop. Clock. One of them is the issues that you just addressed, which has to do with, I'm just thinking of the list of problems and challenges. Net neutrality, the protection of data, all that you elaborated very, very well. That is an interesting set of issues. And what is interesting is, like, I have been doing this kind of stuff for 25 years. At the beginning, we lacked a language that was actually about people's problems, people's interests. It was very much a techie language that we had, properties of the technologies. And today we have a large list of terms that have a particular characteristic. They connect the technology to a real problem, a challenge, an opportunity. That is a change, actually. That is a change from 25 years ago. And in a way, as I was hearing you speak, I was thinking that one should really, expand that list, because each term that we capture when we name something, especially these kinds of things, we are naming a particular articulation between a technical issue and the consequences or the opportunities it has for people. There is a kind of almost a political language, but you know what? It is a political language that doesn't sort of smell of politics. It is, and to me that also has to do with the fact that these technologies have the capacity to expand the domain of the political. Nicht wahr? Das Politische, nicht die Politik. Die Politik ist auch gut, also ich weiß not, really to bring in new components to politics. Now, I come from a country that is in serious decay, I would say, when it comes to the liberal state, if I may just spend a minute on this. And it seems to me that in our country, much as I respect and admire our president, I think he has a very difficult time dealing with stuff, as it's well known. I mean, it's an impossible situation. And I think it's impossible partly because that kind of state is in decay. So I see as a big project, and the Greens represent that, I would say. Green parties all over, which might be very different, but still they have another project. The issue here is expanding the domain of what we call politics. These technologies, mixed with these thin issues, a thin sociality, can actually really expand the domain for politics, and they can also denationalize politics. I am involved with certain types of networks like anti-trafficking networks, things like that, networks that have to do also with immigrants, and it really creates a globality that is not made of masses of people, that is made of very particular groupings and their projects. Now, you can do that also at a national level, but it is this notion of that it is thin enough, that sociality, that socialness, that you can incorporate enormously diverse. And then the work of making that a viable politics begins. Now, a bit more on, besides the list that was mentioned, I want to add to that list a couple of things that enter a bit more also in the question of the technology. So let me give you a couple of elements that come from finance, not because I want to talk about finance, but because I want to use the case of finance to show an extreme that is a vanguard in the use of this technology. And I want to ask the question, how is civil society doing? Now, we have the Pirate Party, you have a Congress, right, what is it, Chaos Kommunikationskongress, you have a lot of very sort of interesting projects in terms of the technology. But let me throw it out as a provocation. You can fight back when we have discussion time. That finance is way ahead. I'm a critic of finance, but believe me. So let's start with formats. We talk a lot about network society. We have, quite a bit of that. We are networked societies. Finance has a format. I'm talking about high finance, not little banks. High finance has a format, which is a format of the future. And they are using and developing that format, not for the interests of people in general. So, for instance, as you probably know, there is one entity, a corporation with shareholders, that owns the New York Stock Exchange, the Paris Bourse, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the Brussels Stock Exchange, and the Lisbon Stock Exchange. Now, is that the old version of mergers and acquisitions, where one company like Daimler-Benz, I think, tried to buy one of the American Chryslers or whatever it was, and so you want to make it one, and you want to sort of throw out whatever you don't need. You make one firm out of a merger. No, that's old format. Most corporations, multinational corporations, are old format, and they know it. They are really trying to understand, how do we produce a new platform from which to conduct our business? Finance creates a super and uber corporation that owns these different stock markets and wants to keep each one of them there. Highly networked, but still, it's still the stock exchange of Lisbon, it's still the stock exchange of Paris, etc. But at the same time, up there is ownership, there is control, there is management, and there is shareholder value. In other words, all negatives. Now, to succeed at this format, that took some innovating. And so my question is, how can we in civil society combine, because what the combination is the particularity, the specificity of each of these places. Now, they are a certain kind of place, stock markets, with some sort of a global platform from which supposedly everybody can then benefit who is part of the story. I hope, by the way, that I'm not speaking too fast, my English. Is it okay? It's fine. Okay, good. So, the second element about finance, the question of speed. Because one thing that, and you mentioned that too, one issue that these technologies allow is a different temporality in terms of how a project gets constituted, gets mobilized, gets what it wants to get out of that project. Now, so I don't know if some of you have heard, but we now have what we call predator algorithms. You know, an algorithm is a crucial element of software. You don't need to know what it is exactly, but it is a critical component. It's like the building block, the DNA almost of a software. Predators are those little machines. This is a relationship to another thing. Those machines that are dropping the guns, the bombs in Afghanistan, in whatever, in Iraq, manned from Florida. Florida beaches, bikinis. So there they sit and they decide where we're going to drop the bombs. So the notion of predator algorithms in finance comes from that notion. Now, look what's happening. This is a conflict inside finance. This is interesting. This is interesting for those of us who think that finance has far too much power. So, stock markets, they have state-of-the-art technology. But you know what? Right next door to them, in Hong Kong, in London, in New York, I don't know if in Frankfurt, by the way, you have big buildings taken over by private networks of financial capital directed by stockbrokers, by bankers, mostly financiers, or what they call dark pools of money. In other words, money that nobody knows where it came from. So it could be from drugs, it could be from illegal arm dealing, who knows? Now here comes the predator algorithm. The predator algorithm moves so fast, 1,000 transactions in a second. It's just faster than the algorithms used in the stock market. So, in May, we had a sudden fall in the stock market of 1,000 points, and nobody knew what had happened. And then an investigation began. What happens is that the private networks send their software, their trading, instruments into the stock markets, bring in the money, move very fast, take it back. If there is a bad outcome in the private network, the stock market will register it, but they won't know why. What happened? They think it's a technical glitch. No, it is other financiers coming in, taking the money, doing their negotiations, and then returning it there with an outcome. So a predator, it's like stealing. Now, the notion here is when you close your eyes, like when you whatever, how we call that, you think you haven't missed anything, but you actually have missed something. Well, multiply that by 1,000 moves in a second. That's what's happening. Now, I think, for instance, part of my politics, this conflict within finance, that's stuff for our politics. Because this is finance dropping predator bombs on another part of finance, and both are very, very powerful. If they could only, fight each other. I am a critic of when finance goes beyond a certain point. I don't mean to offend anybody on that. But I'm just giving you examples here of what is being done with this technology. Now, I want to go back, now civil society. I want to go back 20 years when there was a move to do a multilateral investment agreement. That was one of the first global successful actions on the part of civil society against the sort of the new hyper neoliberal elites like WTO, etc. And we did a very simple action. We bombarded, but in all, it was like 72 countries' parliaments. We bombarded their email, their telephones, but especially everything was mostly done electronically, frankly. We bombarded their communication infrastructure with, notices against, this is not possible, etc. It got so bad that they cut it. They stopped the negotiations. OECD was handling these negotiations. Now, that was a very quick action that we did. They had been working on it for 4 years. It became simply impossible. There were also the demonstrations against WTO. But that was an electronic. None of us went to a demonstration. None of us showed our faces. We just used the technology. Now, it's an elementary use, but it was extremely successful. And so in that sense, I just want to say that it's not a question of the most complex. It's also very elementary. And really an interesting politics can be done. Now, again, a bit more on the technical properties. So what I have seen, and here I think somebody like Geert Lovink, many of you must know who he is, at least some of you must know. And anyhow, he's been a very significant theorist and also developer of alternative technologies. His latest thing now is we have to do away with what is it called? Facebook. Yeah? Facebook. So the line that I like that he gives is, do we want social networking to gather, like you gather berries, to gather friends, in quotation marks, friends? Or do gather, I hope that the term is clear, like you gather berries, feel, whatever. To gather friends, in quotation marks, also nicht wirkliche Freunde eigentlich. Or do we want to use it to make politics, to make new types of politics. There is an enormous amount of energy, you all know this, that goes into Facebook, that goes into Twitter. Some of it is very interesting. Some interesting possibilities happen, but mostly it is not. And here I want to bring up something that I think is also a theme that is a bit left out of the picture. And that is a question. Among all the users of these technologies, who are the ones who are absolutely simply, or not who are the people, actually what are the situations where one just simply consumes an existing set of options? The simplest example is you go shopping online and you just click your way through existing options. A political party, sure, they have that for certain things, but they must also have an open source. I'm sure you Greens have that. An open source where you can actually bring in other projects, other possibilities. Now, I have been very and in that sense, you use open source in a slightly different sense, but still it is a form of open source. Now, I have been very interested in understanding in civil society. I use civil society in a very broad sense. It could be political parties, it could be, it's a shorthand for enormous diversity. I've been very interested, who are the makers in civil society? Who make? Who generates a demand for changes? So let me give you some extreme cases. Now, I'm always around the world, so I'm talking about things that are far away, but the same thing could be happening right here in Germany, in Brandenburg, whatever. So, fishermen, by with a wonderful foundation in India, they connected. Fishermen told some person in this very modest little foundation, you know what we could really use is weather announcements, when does a storm come, etc. Now, none of those fishermen are online. Now, we are talking very isolated places, all right? And so they found a very simple system. You hook up to whatever the weather satellites, you can go to whatever Google weather. Then you need a few transactions, and you make it into a radio transmission, right? So that all the fishermen can hear. I tried to do something like that with health clinics in the poor neighborhoods of New York City. The health clinic, the little health clinic, not the big hospital, it's a very interesting place where you can actually use the technology. We also tried it with workplaces, by the way, and mostly focused on women and telling them about their rights, etc. And during lunchtime, you transmit some of this. Now, you transmit it in different ways, right? Again, these are technical issues. But I just want to emphasize that there are a lot of possibilities with these technologies to actually generate what needs to be done, the contents that need to be produced from very modest people who are not into the technology, but their needs can really be translated. So one of the little things that I did once was grandmothers. It was an accidental thing, but I was part of a team in a Spanish city, Zaragoza, with very highfalutin MIT engineers, etc. And we are digitizing the whole of Zaragoza. We have been at it for 5 years, brilliant, wonderful. In the middle of that project, like midway through, they were just talking about how to educate all the people, the young people, the older people. I said, wait a minute. We have to be educated by them as well. And so I sort of launched, it happened to be with media, there was a press conference. I said, but I was so incensed by how they were describing what we were doing, the engineers. I don't have anything against engineers, by the way, I love them, but anyway, these engineers. And so I said, well, what about, I want to know what the grandmothers of Zaragoza, las abuelas de Zaragoza, abuelas is a great word in Spanish, I must say. It sounds better than grandmother. Wie sagt man das auf Deutsch? Die Großmutter. Yeah, no, abuela is its own word. You see, it's not that you're a grandmother, you are abuela. So I want to know, what are the abuelas of Zaragoza doing? We can learn from their practices, which have nothing to do with the technology. We can then bring those practices onto digital space and make something happen. Well, after I said that, I started to get emails from all over the world, well, mostly the Spanish-speaking world, which is quite a bit. They said, we also are trying to organize a grandmother, because grandmothers are interesting figures. They have a lot of knowledge, they have time, they have their own way of seeing, they see. They are witnesses, they are observers. So they are a great set of people. But I'm just giving you examples here that we can learn. There was another project I was involved in. I can't remember the organization, a wonderful organization in South Africa. So a company that shall remain unnamed, we wanted to do a study, go into a village economy. Now, I'm talking about other parts of the world, but you can translate it into your own particularities. And we wanted to see how could these people use these technologies? And my notion was the same as with the Abuela de Zaragoza, What are their practices that could be put online, And you could also do that with political party objectives, of course. And then this very famous corporation said, well, we will bring all the computers and we will wire up the whole village and that will be development. And it was a horror. I immediately said, no, we don't wire up the whole village. This is a very important issue, it seems to me. We don't simply wire up the whole village and assume that development will come because we brought them this technology. No. What matters is, what are they doing? And how do we bridge that into an online capacity that they can then take further and network around the world? Now, this is stuff that anthropologists are very significant in helping to set up. This is wonderful work, and one can start in one's neighborhood. So in Venice, I think, was one of those, I can't remember where, in Italy, they have set up in the city all these neighborhood maps, the map of the city, but from your neighborhood perspective. Because again, the maps that you usually have from your city are centered in the center of power, which often is a very beautiful center of power, clearly in European cities. But it is an interesting way of mapping. What happens when in your neighborhood, you have an electronic map where you look at the city from your neighborhood? One of the things that happens is that people, through tracking it electronically, right there in their little neighborhood square, they begin to understand the other ways of moving through the city that they could have. And then you begin to understand that, for instance, there's a lot of privatizing of space that is public in cities. You all know that. So that people, modest people very often think that, oh no, I can't go through that neighborhood. Now, sometimes they have good reasons because there might be racisms and things like that. I can go through that neighborhood because that's not really, I'll go around. And so this becomes a mobilizing of people. This is our city. Now, again, you are members of a political party. You can translate that into politics. For instance, in one Latin American city, we organized on the weekends people from the slums who worked in the city. This was in Buenos Aires. And we said, here's how you could walk to your job or bike or whatever. And it often meant going through elite neighborhoods. And they felt that was not their city. But we said, the streets are public. If you pay any taxes, and some slum dwellers pay taxes, you've contributed to these streets. So anyhow, I'm just saying that there are many little technologies that can, where these technologies can help. We organize these people basically technological, with via internet, and then we made a point of here we meet and then we start walking, because they needed to have people like us there too who were not from the slums. Now, all of these little examples that I'm giving you get at the point that the same technologies that allow finance to grow its power, concentrate its power, and then actually begin to self-destruct at the top. In that point of intersection, finance goes that way. The way I've been describing the use of these technologies is going in the opposite way, which is multi-sited, distributed nodes that constitute, if you want, the space for deploying these technical capacities. Now, that is, I think, where these technologies, I'm talking about interactive computer-centered networks, basically, are fantastic. Finance uses it too. That's a point of interaction. They use it to do what? Give me the money. No matter who you are, give it to me, give it to me. You know, all over the world, they concentrate and then they go their way. This is just the opposite. This is, give me your knowledge practices, give me your informal knowledge, give me your projects, give me your ideas. Let's begin to distribute. Let's spread these possibilities to other places. I have found, for instance, that there are certain slums. Now you can tell that I'm thinking about slums. So now I have a project that is the global city and the global slum. Now, there is a lot of informal knowledge making in some of these slums. Now, if these big slums in Indian cities, for instance, they have a lot of technology actually there. They are, you know, that is part of the way the economy has gone, etc. So they get the second-rate technology, but it is okay. And so they actually invent ways of using the technology that we, the middle-class schleps that we are, don't even think about it. And so I think that and this is another point that I would like to make. Your texts on there. So the weight of these social logics in shaping the technology. What I said at the beginning, one of the tragedies, and I think it's a critical point for combat, I would say, is that certain logics, the logic of finance, the logic of controlling our private information to expand markets, all the things that you listed at the beginning, that certain logics dominate in the development. What I see is that when I go to a place like the slums, where for survival they have to be innovative, they invent lots of practices. And in the case of Indian slums, they can put them online. That doesn't happen in all slums. So I think when I think of the neighborhoods, I think of immigrant communities, I think of spaces where, say, unemployed people gather. We have a lot of that in the United States. You have quite a few here in Germany. You know, there are many sub-communities that we need to reach. And that is a kind of that we need to reach, and then we can work with these technologies. These technologies are mutants. They mutate. They can really adapt. That is why I started out with this this notion of an ecology of. Now, the second point on this slide, in this context, you know, if you have this sort of openness and you're grabbing in, open source can bring not only technical consequence, I think open source is very important, by the way, can bring not only technical consequences, but also social ones. I'm using social in a very broad sense, you know, it could be political, etc. Now, out of this is a whole sort of domain, I would say, that I call informal knowledge and informal knowledge practices. Knowledge practices is a concept that I don't know if it communicates well to you, but it is also, knowledge doesn't just fall from the sky. Knowledge is made. Yes, we have knowledge coming back to the clicking your way and collecting knowledge that already exists. But there are two segments in society that make knowledge. And they make it because they have to. And they have very specific knowledge practices. One of them is at the top, elites. To be elites, one thing is just to be rich. Another thing is to be an elite. An elite has multiple infrastructures, social, whatever, they make knowledge. So finance is an extreme example. But the others are the poor, the modest, the unemployed, you know, the prosperous middle classes are comfortable. They consume knowledge, they consume. But when you are unemployed suddenly, when you are suddenly marginalized, like the abuelas de Zaragoza, when you are poorer than your parents were, you're in emergency mode. You have to also innovate. You have to find a way, or you break in a way. And so I find that at the bottom, you know, that bottom is getting bigger and bigger. You have a lot of these kind of knowledge practices too. But the point about coming back to civil society, the point of picking up the practices, the needs, etc., of people all over, in your neighborhood, in your cities, in your country, in the regions where you're interested in or moving through, is also that it is capturing a kind of knowledge that I would describe an informal knowledge, which is enormously important. And I think I should probably start to end. I want to pick up on this issue of informal knowledge and say that if I were a politician, and I do this as a theorist rather than as a politician, I think that one of the key practices, and I think I heard, I heard you say that, I thought not in the words that I will say it, is the active rendering, making unstable what have become stabilized meanings. Now, throughout this talk, that is what I was doing a bit. You know, when I spoke about this point of intersection, the notion that poor people or limited resources people could have a point of intersection in the use of the technology with finance that is destabilizing something that is presented as a binary. Oh, there is finance, it can do what we cannot do, and here are we. So I think that I feel the same thing about powerlessness. Some of you may have heard me say this in some other setting, but I think that in our societies, and that comes from being a prosperous middle-class society, which I think is an adorable condition to have. I'm not against that. But I think we also need to recognize we pay a price, I think, for that. So it seems to me that in our sort of looking at the world from our middle-class perspective, it is very easy to feel that if you're powerless, in other words, the rest, you know, the poorer, the whatevers, the only thing that makes a difference is if you gain power, or, more beautiful word, if you are empowered. I think that is a problem, because that leaves powerlessness, and most people in the world are powerless. Probably most people in Berlin have a certain kind of powerlessness. But that leaves the powerless sort of out of history. They don't make history. And so I'm very interested in recovering under what conditions do the powerless make history, even if they do not gain power. So I don't want to collapse, you know, you're powerless or you're empowered. No, I think that powerlessness is itself a space of multiple different situations. I think these technologies, I have seen it, I have studied it, have helped a lot of powerless to make history, to make politics, even if they did not become really empowered. I have seen that with Afghani women. I have seen that with other groups of women in other parts of the world. I have seen it with fishermen and with farmers. I have seen it in very practical worlds. And I think that this is really extraordinary. And again, if I were a politician, I would want to understand how can we move in that direction of, yes, you're powerless, we don't have the power to give you power, but we will enable you to make something, to make politics. And in that sense, we, the middle classes, we consume our democracy. I don't think the Green Party, I think Green Party is by definition already a transversal point of entry. I'm not talking necessarily about you here, but I think sort of the large Bürgerschaften, I don't know if you say that in German, but anyhow, there is a bit of a consuming of our democracy, consuming of our rights, consuming of what we have gained or what others in the past have gained, rather than making. And so in that sense, I learn from these disadvantaged people because they have to make, otherwise they are really stuck, etc. Now, I need to conclude, and I want to conclude with talking about the city, because here we are in Berlin. And I want to invite us to think how cities, and I just found out that Berlin's about 800 years old or something. Is that so? But think Istanbul, 3,000, many different names. Cities have outgrade, and I don't mean great, I mean complex cities. You have to be a bit complex. Cities have outlasted very powerful enterprises. Most firms have gone down. They eventually go down. You know, they get merged, they disappear. National governments, kingdoms, empires, they all go down. The only one that seems to survive is the Catholic Church, but that's a very special kind of entity. And cities remain. the destruction of a city is the beginning of its rebuilding. If you destroy a firm, it's gone. If a kingdom is destroyed, it's gone. So there is something about the more formal, closed, and abstract formats of national governments, of big enterprises like global firms, of kingdoms, etc., that makes them brittle. And there is something about the messiness, a bit of anarchy that a big city has, and above all, two things. Its materiality, the actual stuff, how you get your food, where is the water, etc., and their incompleteness. Cities are incomplete, and I think it's that incompleteness that makes them survive. Now, the city is, to me, the ultimate space where these thin socialities can thrive. So I have spent quite a bit of time trying to understand how localities, within a same city, different localities begin to connect with each other in totally new ways because of these technologies. So that this whole repositioning, what I was saying before, just about that electronic map that looks at the city from the perspective of the neighborhood, that is one little element in that. But I do think that a city like Berlin, you have so much, and you have incredible open source, you have enormous talent, the most advanced technologies, that are doing also parallel, not just all commercial. So it's an extraordinary city. The Green Party, I allow myself to say this out of enthusiasm. I'm not. The Green Party, by definition, has an agenda that will expand what it means to be a political party to domains which the other parties often stay away from. You have a formidable mix here in Berlin, and I really wish you the best, but there's work to be done. Thank you very much. Do I take the question? Oh, you take the questions.
No, you can stay.
So if you have questions, criticisms, whatever, and do just briefly say who you are. Yes. Luis Fernandez. We
Sie
need a
müssen
mic
ans Mikrofon gehen, bitte. Sonst ist es mit der Übersetzung etwas schwierig.
Ja, aber Sie versteht doch besser Englisch als Deutsch, oder?
Sie können es auf Deutsch auch sagen.
Nee,
ich
besser
verstehe es
nicht.
schon.
Nee.
Besser nicht, ja.
Okay, my name is Luis Fernandez.
We got that.
Okay. I think you're missing a very important part of the use of internet. And I find that you're very fixated on groups, on communities, or any other social entities. Now, perhaps I can tell you something about myself. I think that when somebody uses internet, they are exercising an individual right. And they don't have to be part of the Abuelos de Zaragoza or Abuelos de Berlin.
Sure.
They can
Absolutely.
do it without anybody.
Absolutely.
And in my case, you see, I have the impression I live in a society where one does not have the right to think.
To what?
To think.
To think.
Right. This right doesn't exist.
Okay.
Because if I were offline, then people would then tell me, you can't think because nobody gave you permission for it, because you violate the penal code, because you violate the Constitution, because you violate the Deutsche Leitkultur, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Okay. And so therefore, I use internet to escape from this world.
Yes,
and I go into another world, a noosphere, so to speak.
Right.
And,
okay, fine, got it, yeah.
All right.
So I didn't talk about individuals and a space of escape, and I said it in passing when I said that some of the things of Facebook are very good and very nice for people, because that was not the project here. The project here was, in fact, connecting, expanding, bringing people in a thin reality. What you do individually, and that is fine, and I think that that's mostly how it gets used. I don't think that that's a serious challenge at this point. People are using it for escaping, and that's great. So I am not at all against that. I probably do that myself too. When I'm bored with my own writing, I go navigate through, to discover websites. I love that. A certain kind of website, but, because there are millions of them. So I don't disagree. But that does not mean that seeing that there's work to be done in terms of articulating, very localized. It's this mix of a localized concern, a localized effort, a parochial view. Not everybody's cosmopolitan. Luckily, imagine what it would be like. And then to connect it to some broader, thin sociality. That is really what I was talking about. So I don't exclude what you're saying. Thank you for making the comment. Yes.
Gibt es weitere Fragen? Kann ich mal Saft haben, bitte?
Yeah, he is there, but he can't. Right.
Bitte. Hello, my name is Alex Shestak. I'm a member of the Green Party, and I'm very interested in Netzpolitik. What I'm missing a bit in your speech is the early times of the Internet, when it was the other way around, when societies built in very similar technologies like IRC or MADS, where different cultures or different subcultures built in these technologies. And I think you should combine your view with this view, because it's
right.
very similar to your view.
No, that's very interesting, and I think, when I talked about finance, grossly speaking, I was also these two new worlds of finance. So there is, but I'm sorry that that wasn't clear, because I think that's critical to me. Is to bring, a capacity, these technologies, bring them into very specific settings, and that is why I said at the beginning, that slide, that the technical properties come to life in very specific settings. So the technical properties can be deployed in many, many different ways, but they come to life, in a certain... So that is why a data pipeline does not interest me, because that's sort of, I want these interactive domains. One of the issues that hangs in there, which has received a lot of negative publicity, of course, is how you can be somebody else. You can be a thinner you without the baggage of all of that. Now, it has most of the attention has gone to very negative, right? An old man pretending he's a young man talking to a young girl, etc. But there are very interesting other things that are happening there. And I happen to be one of those who thinks that these thin, I said it several times, right, that these thin socialities are very important if we want to network across precisely, these different groups, these different cultures, etc., etc. So yes, thank you.
Weitere Fragen?
Ich hätte selber eine Frage.
Ja.
Und zwar, Sie haben ja von den Electronic Interactive Domains gesprochen als Ecologies. Nur sind wir ja...
No, that's one thing. The ecology is also non-technical, the non-X.
Okay. Wie sehen Sie denn Möglichkeiten der Regulierung, die auf der einen Seite ja notwendig durchaus ist in einem weltweiten System und auf der anderen Seite die Netzfreiheit ja nicht bedrohen sollte?
Yeah, well, I have written quite a bit about that subject because I'm very interested. I'm interested in, say, to use a sort of a bit of a technical language, the jurisdictions that are created with these domains, and of course the tension that we're all very aware of between the thick, most effective regulatory apparatuses are national still. You have the European Union, very effective too in many ways, and the jurisdictions themselves, the spaces of these go way beyond. Now you see that in a lot of domains you don't need the technologies, but those technologies produce particularly interesting domains. Now, when I talked about informal knowledge practices and informal, not just knowledge, but informal knowledge practices, I was getting at that kind of thing too. I was trying to to give you a pretty positive, except when I spoke about finance. But I do think that there is making happening, in these domains. And then one of the issues that I work on is I ask myself, how did we start regulating basic sectors, train systems, coal mines? A lot of the knowledge came from the practices of people. The coal miners said, we need protection on A, B, C, D. The train operators, the long train. It's not that comes back to what you were saying, but in another content. In a lot of domains that we now see as very abstract regulatory frameworks, actually the knowledge came from the workers, from the managers, from whoever was involved. So it's sort of an interesting issue. What tends to come really from the top are elements that we then call basic law. We experience them as coming, but even there, like in Germany, you have basic law, you call it, right? We call it the constitution, etc. I mean, that depends on what kind of a constitution you have. It can be sufficiently open that anything fits in. So in that sense, it's very abstract. But very often that too comes, from the base. So this to me is extremely interesting, this issue of how do we, and again, the language of jurisdiction is a bit different from regulation. I find regulation a word that either communicates something very basic, which is very important, but not much more. And of course, for me, a basic premise is that the law is not always about justice. We have, in the United States, we are chock full of laws that if you violate them, you go to jail. But it's not about justice. It really is about something else. And I mean, I have a whole thing in this book, that's Paradoxes National, and how, but anyhow, that's not the lecture I'm supposed to be giving here. So to me, these are all working problematics, but at the limit, I would say, not always, at the limit, I think it's a variable. At this end, they're familiar, because regulating any domain brought in stuff from the bottom, from the middle, and from the top to create. Right? At this end, they produce a whole new family of possibilities and of regulatory holes. Agujero, how do you say that? A hole, where there is nothing.
Nichts.
Ein Loch, Löcher. Regulatory Löcher, that there is nothing there. And those are also very interesting, and some of these are very interesting. I think that this stuff that I briefly alluded to under the notion of informal knowledge and informal knowledge practices tries to capture this. Now, if we think of how Silicon Valley, where a lot of these technologies began, it's one of several places, all right? It's been exaggerated a bit. It all started informally, as the famous garage story. Because that's the way you could experiment. Otherwise, you were too regulated. So, it's sort of, one has to, but I think that right now, those were the issues that were mentioned by your party leader here, or Vorsitzender, Parlamentar Vorsitzender, whatever language I invented there. Those are issues that we're dealing with right now. They are so familiar, they are discussed, that I didn't think that I could add very much. And the specificity of your German law, your German condition also, or the European, you have. So, but I think that those are the issues right now. Net neutrality, the question of protection of data, the question of right to information that, it's shrinking with every passing month, it seems. But I add to that these issues of who's pushing the technology. I think it's very interesting that in the mid-90s, 1993, you see that the curve begins to happen when the commercial use of the Internet expands. I did a little research project. I said, so what kind of software is being made now? The two main types of software that were being developed were billing, how to bill online, how to get, and like for FedEx and things like that. And the other one was, what was I going to say now? Protection, sort of that you could have your copyright protected, everything. In other words, it was a very corporate type of thing. Now, there were the alter networks, the whole other world of open source, etc. That was a different story, but the mainstream. So, my question then with finance today, is to what extent is it leading too much in terms of what kind of software we're developing? I have this conversation with hardware the engineers, the computer scientists who develop the hardware. I want to understand if there are parts in the hardware that we're not using because we don't have the software. I have a little list of my pet uses that I would like to see happen. And it's a very difficult question to answer for them too, because in a way the software activates the hardware. But I always think that there are these black holes, that's in schwarze Löcher, wie sagt man that, from the space, right? Where a lot of stuff is there, capacities in hardware that are not being activated by any software. I think these are very interesting questions. They don't have simple answers, but they are sort of... Yes?
Yeah.
So, if there is no more question, then maybe we should call it an evening, and I think there is a party now or something like that. Thank you very much for your attention.